Good afternoon, guests, and welcome to today's webinar on what we've learned so far through the implementation of Homekey in Greater Los Angeles and around the state. My name is Jamar Wilson, Southern California market leader at Enterprise Community Partners, a national nonprofit that for 40 years exists to make a good home possible for the millions of families without one. Our mission is to make home and community a place of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. We're here today to share some research findings and promote discussion with practitioners and public partners about the rollout of the Homekey program in Los Angeles. We'd like to thank the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation for the opportunity to conduct this research, and for our project partner CTY Housing, and notably Yasmin Tong, for their contributions in interviewing program stakeholders, capturing lessons learned, and developing some project-level case studies that we plan to share soon. We also want to thank Carolina Reid, faculty research advisor at UC Berkeley's Terner Center, who broke away from her busy schedule to reflect on some broader statewide findings about the program's implementation since it launched in 2020. And last but not least, I'd like to also recognize the efforts of our very own Mark Tusignant and Ayat Ali. Mark directs our solutions work on homelessness in Southern California, and is unfortunately out ill this week and can't be a part of the program today. Ayat Ali is our Vulnerable Populations Fellow, who has worked especially hard on organizing this webinar. I thank you both for your contributions to our great work. And now I turn it over to Yasmin to give an overview of what to expect today. Thank you all, and enjoy today's session. Yasmin?
Thank you, Jamar. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yasmin Tong. I'm the founder of CTY Housing, and we work with affordable housing developers and public agencies to advance affordable housing through every stage of the development process. And we also work on public policy when it informs implementation for housing development or preservation. I'm delighted to be here today and wanted to just give you a quick overview of our agenda. First, we will have Carolina Reid, who's a distinguished professor at the Don Terner. She's the Don Terner Distinguished Professor in Affordable Housing and Urban Policy from UC Berkeley, who'll be providing our keynote address. And followed by that, I will be providing a high-level overview of our findings about the implementation of Project Homekey in LA. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion and a lively with Elizabeth Ben-Ishai from the Homeless Initiative for LA County, Jennifer Hart-Dietz from PATH, Stephanie Klasky-Gamer from LA Family Housing, Tim Lawless from HCD, who's the branch chief of Project Homekey, Veronica Lewis, who's the director of HOPIX, John Masseri, who's with the People Concern, Ann Sewell from the LA Housing Department, and I'll be moderating. And then we'll wrap up with reflections, and also we'll have have an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to, at any time, include your questions in the chat as we proceed through the program. Okay, and so now I'd like to introduce Carolina Reid.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for Enterprise's partnership in everything that we do. I'm really delighted to be here today. In my remarks, I'm going to share some highlights from a recent report we did on Homekey, which you can find on the Terner Center's website. I think somebody's going to put the link to the report in the chat in case you want to directly click on it. This report was really a team effort, and I'd like to thank my co-authors, Ryan Finnegan and Shazia Manji. I'd like to thank HCD for their partnership and support on this project. And then also thank you to the Wells Fargo Foundation, which supported our work. I'm going to start today by setting just really briefly the context in which Homekey was developed. First slide, please, or next slide. Even prior to COVID-19, the state was experiencing an unprecedented rise in homelessness. In 2020, we estimate that more than 160,000 people in California experienced homelessness on a given night, and we know that's an undercount. The majority of these individuals and families were unsheltered. I think somebody might still have their sound on. I'm hearing a lot of background. Ooh, that's better. Sorry about that. Okay, so the majority of these individuals and families were unsheltered. California is really unique in that way. It has the highest rate of unsheltered homelessness across the country. And really, when we think about the homelessness crisis, we really need to think about it as a crisis of housing. And one of the root causes we need to address is the shortage of deeply affordable housing across the state. There are many reasons for this shortage, but chief among them is that the system for building affordable housing is underfunded, fragmented, and slow, and it can take years to get a project funded and entitled, let alone built and occupied. Next slide, please. The pandemic prompted a few really important shifts. First, there was a recognition that COVID-19 represented a significant health risk to people experiencing homelessness, and that typical congregate shelters in which many people share a single space were not sufficient to protect their health. COVID-19 also mobilized the federal government to direct billions in economic aid. Further, the pandemic's impact on the tourism sector provided an opportunity to think about that type of real estate as a housing solution. And I think it's important to recognize that California's Project Homekey really took advantage of that underutilized stock and leased hotel and motel rooms to provide temporary non-congregate shelter for people experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Homekey was developed to permanently build on Project Homekey and provide access to funds for permanent housing. It was launched by California's Department of Housing and Community Development in July of 2020. And it fits within a larger state effort to dramatically expand funding to address the homelessness crisis, as shown in the chart here. The orange bar shows how much more funding HCD has to support the expansion of housing for people experiencing homelessness, including Homekey. I'm not going to get into the detailed aspects of the program here, but in a nutshell, Homekey provides public entities with large-scale grants to purchase properties like hotels and motels and convert them into interim and permanent supportive housing. This is also referred to as PSH, and it's a model in which pairs affordable housing with wraparound services. There are a few aspects to Homekey that I think are important to point out. Critically, Homekey provides the funds in a single grant. This stands in stark contrast to the typical PSH project, which often needs to layer between 10 and 14 different funding sources to pencil. Homekey also implements ambitious timelines, which it supports with regulatory streamlining and CTY exemptions. Next slide, please. These aspects of Homekey have contributed to its success. Statewide, Homekey has created nearly 6,000 new housing units across 94 projects. Most Homekey units are either already operating as permanent supportive housing or have plans to convert from interim to permanent housing in the future. In terms of scale, this number of Homekey units exceeds the number of newly created PSH units in California in any of the 4 prior years. And especially in some regions of the state that tend to have less access to funding, it significantly expanded their supply of permanent supportive housing. Next slide. Another benefit has been cost savings. At least so far, Homekey units have cost less to build than typical affordable housing. The average cost per unit for a Homekey property was $238,000, and this is across the state, which compares to $380,000 for typical acquisitions rehab developments under the low-income housing tax credit program and $500,000 for new construction. In addition to cost savings, interviews also consistently remarked on Homekey speed. One interviewee shared, "All of us, we've never seen anything go from an application to putting people into housing within just a few months' time. That's just unheard of for a state program." Interviewees pointed to regulatory streamlining as critical. For example, saying, "The key ingredient to Homekey's ability to bring units online quickly was its regulatory flexibility. The ability to forego some local planning steps was critical." Next slide. We found that Homekey's quick timelines encouraged an all-hands-on-deck approach to getting projects off the ground, which helped to spur new partnerships that are adding capacity to California's homelessness response system. Homekey required that a public entity be the primary applicant, but co-applicants and other collaborators included affordable housing developers and public and nonprofit service providers. Interviewees emphasized the importance of establishing these partnerships and roles early on. One recommended, and I quote, "making sure you have all the relevant partners with the relevant expertise at the table from the very beginning, so that you can make choices that are really informed by the operations, what the operations are going to look like on the ground," end quote. Respondents also frequently described the program as a positive symbol of the state's commitment to addressing the homelessness crisis. One interviewee said, "Homekey shows that we can have big goals and we can move fast. It signals to folks you're not going to have to live outdoors. Homekey starts from the premise that we can solve homelessness with urgency, resources, collaboration, and political will." Next slide. Although Homekey is known for its hotel and motels conversions, Homekey's flexibility also allowed grantees to implement projects tailored to their local community's needs. In Los Angeles, which is the focus of the rest of the webinar discussion today, the city and county took advantage of Homekey to dramatically expand their ownership of properties and units, and chose to operate many of them as interim housing to meet immediate housing needs. Next slide. In Oakland, the city pursued varied strategies, including purchasing a college dorm that now operates both as a shelter and as PSH for older adults experiencing homelessness. It also adopted an innovative scattered site single-family model, where each home provides shared living for people experiencing homelessness. Next slide. In Mountain View, Life Moves used Homekey funds to purchase a parking lot and developed a modular interim housing community. So there's lots of different approaches across the state, and encourage you to read our report where we profile lots of different ways that people implemented Homekey on the ground. Next slide. Despite these meaningful successes, interviews also pointed to some significant ongoing challenges. One key lesson is that not all existing properties are well suited for conversion into permanent housing. And for some Homekey sites, the costs of conversion are going to double total development costs. For example, Motel 6 sites have proved challenging. One operator noted that the Motel 6 they converted was not in bad condition, but it's just cheaply built. The small rooms in Motel 6 properties and other two-story walk-up hotels are often difficult to convert into livable units, for example, with a kitchen, and will cost much more than initially projected. Several grantees we spoke with were struggling with assembling the financing to do the needed upgrades or conversions, and there are concerns that the cost savings or property quality of Homekey sites will not be sustained over time. Next slide. Homekey grantees also consistently told us that covering long-term operating costs was their biggest worry. As the graph shows, across Homekey properties, there is a significant gap between what the residents can pay in rent and the monthly costs of operating those units. In high-cost markets in particular, operating costs, which can include things like janitorial staff, front desk support, and resident services coordinators, greatly exceed rent payments. Many Homekey properties are relying on federal project-based vouchers to cover these costs, but these are in limited supply, and not all Homekey grantees have access to sufficient vouchers, if any at all. Next slide. The report summarizes other challenges as well, including complicated coordination between multiple public and private entities, identifying who is best suited to managing the site over the long term and the associated risks of taking on that task, and challenges with resident relocation, especially during conversions. We also heard about differences in cultures and expertise across the various entities that need to come together to do Homekey developments. And across the system, we heard that organizations struggled with staffing capacity, low pay and burnout, and the difficulty of recruiting and retaining staff that were trained in providing trauma-informed care. Next slide. In conclusion, HCD's investment in Homekey and the ways in which stakeholders across the state stood up a new program in the middle of a pandemic is a testament to the state's commitment to addressing homelessness and dramatically expanding the supply of interim and permanent housing. Homekey's structure also provides important lessons for other affordable housing programs, such as expanded single source capital funding for acquisition and rehab, streamlined applications, and CTY exemption. But the work can't stop here. There's still a lot to be done to reduce fragmentation in the ways we finance affordable housing, increase funding for operations, and build capacity across the homelessness response system. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Carolina. Next slide. All right, so CTY and Enterprise kind of embarked on this research project in order to share insights about the first round of Project Homekey as it was implemented here locally, and also to provide recommendations that can be used to inform future rounds of funding as well as future implementation here locally. Let's go to the next slide. And our methodology was to basically reach out to the city and the county of Los Angeles, as well as the Housing Authority of Los Angeles, in addition to various stakeholders who've been participating as housing operators in the program. And we conducted a series of interviews with them, which are turning into both a written report as well as 5 case studies that will be available probably in June. Next slide. And so this slide, I just wanted to give like a quick snapshot of how Homekey has changed from round 1 to round 2. And basically, as you can see, the amount of funding has increased, the amount of time to produce, the deliverables has increased, and the amount of housing has increased. I think there are 3 really important takeaways overall. One is that I think Project Homekey really demonstrated the ability of local and state government to collaborate along with nonprofit housing owner operators, and to be able to get things done quickly when the resources are available and the political will is there. The second is that I think there's real value in having multiple funding rounds because that has really enabled both the state and local jurisdictions to refine and revise their strategies for using these funds. And the third thing is that converting the properties from motel to interim use has been extremely challenging under the timeframes imposed in round 1, and was way more expensive than anyone had anticipated. And that has important implications for converting these properties again to permanent supportive housing. So it raises a couple of big questions. One is, where is that money going to come from? And 2, what can we do to help streamline that conversion to permanent supportive housing process? Next slide. So some of our key findings were that, Homekey enabled housing operators to expand their asset base without taking on a lot of financial risk associated with real estate development. and also that the change in ownership actually, in many instances, helped to stabilize neighborhoods. There was one instance where one property basically had, a bunch of sheriff's deputies just parked out in the parking lot. And once it came under the Project Homekey, then the sheriffs were able to go away, and a property that was across the street that was never able to stay rented has stayed rented. So, so those are some positive outcomes that have come out of this. Another interesting outcome was that, according to the LA County Homeless Initiative, there was a higher acceptance rate among chronically homeless adults for Homekey rooms than congregate facilities. And so that means that, these high acuity people are able to access intensive case management services that they may not have been able to access otherwise. Let's go down to the next slide. And then, but another thing that was a pretty constant, a recurring theme among a number of operators was that the cost of operating interim housing is not covered by the actual bed night rate that is paid. And so a lot of operators are coming out of pocket to support operations at these properties. We're also seeing that some of the operators have actually started, they're well into the planning of converting to permanent supportive housing, but that's not because they've been able to access public funds. It's because they've been able to access philanthropic dollars. And I think another really important thing to keep in mind there too is that those organizations are kind of moving ahead on faith that they'll be able to access operating subsidy, specifically project-based vouchers, at the time that they are ready to occupy those units as permanent supportive housing. And then, let's see, another consideration is that we think that there's more that that could happen locally in terms of streamlining the process for approving the rehab scope and providing building permits. And so that is really, I think that's going to be an important area for where more coordination can occur. And then finally, there's an assessment of participant level outcomes that we think is still needs to happen. And everything with the program has been moving so quickly that it's been hard to kind of assemble a good data set that can be used to inform policy going forward. Next slide. So these are some of our recommendations, not all of them. But locally, as I'd mentioned earlier, I mean, one of the key things is trying to remove barriers and decrease the cost of converting the Homekey interim sites into permanent supportive housing. So some suggestions would be to expedite plan check, inspections, and approvals, waiving permits and fees to the extent that's legally allowable, and also creating like an intergovernmental advisory teams to help assist operators in pulling their projects through the plan check and building sign-off approval processes, and also to help with building capacity among those housing operators that don't have in-house development capacity. And then at the state level, a lot of our recommendations really just have to do with, making more money available and more flexibility. I think to put a finer point on that, though, on the operating subsidies, HCD allows a relatively short time in which the operating subsidy can be funded. So over 3 to 4 years is basically when the operating subsidy amount needs to be fully dispersed, but it would be better to have more flexibility with that and to have a longer period of time in which to draw down those funds. And then one of the allowed uses for Project Homekey is adaptive reuse. But because of the abbreviated timeframes for from basically award of a project to getting it occupied, it makes it impossible to do adaptive reuse. And so that perhaps it would be worthwhile to extend the time frame that's allowed for adaptive reuse properties to meet those performance requirements. Next slide. All right, so now it's time for our panel discussion. I would like to introduce, well, actually, we've already kind of done introductions, so we'll just dive right into questions. Tim, I wanted to ask you, what does the future look like for Project Homekey? We have round 3 coming up. Can you provide any kind of preview about what kind of program changes you're anticipating?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Yasmin. So as you mentioned, we have Homekey round 3 coming up. That notice of funding availability is scheduled to be released in October. And for the 22-23 fiscal year, we have about 1.3 billion slated to be available to make awards. So we're looking forward to this next round. I will say that, obviously prior to releasing that notice of funding availability, we'll be doing some robust stakeholder outreach to learn from all our applicants and other stakeholders, sort of what worked well this round, where's there opportunity for improvement. We really value that process, and we look forward to kind of going through that. With that said, maybe a few things to highlight. This round of Homekey, the second round, we have seen a pretty big increase in the projects that are going to permanent supportive housing straight away. We did some very intentional program shifts to sort of encourage that, for different reasons. So I think that is good to see. And I would imagine there'll be, a continued emphasis on encouraging those sorts of projects that are going to be permanent, sort of from the get-go. Of course, the sort of sustainability of these projects is top of mind. We want to make sure these projects are going to be in operation and doing very well over the long term. So we'll take a look at sort of our operating award, and if that is sufficient or not. Thinking through, incentivizing the use of vouchers. Obviously, there's a shortage of vouchers writ large in the state, but projects with vouchers are obviously in a good position over the long term. And then also thinking through, maybe more mixed income projects. That's one way to solve this sustainability issue, to the extent that projects can maybe serve Homekey clients as well as those at perhaps higher AMI levels. That's another way that we can maybe encourage sustainability for Homekey sites. And we gave we had a little bit of that in the current NELFA, but we would love to explore that more, and maybe encourage that more in the next round. And then finally, kind of the supportive services piece. We really want to make sure these sites are set up for success. So just sort of ensuring and encouraging and validating that all these sites have a real robust suite of services in place, so that the client outcomes that you referenced, Yasmin, are really stellar for all the Homekey sites. So I'll stop there. Those are a few of the things that come to mind, but in general, we really look forward to engaging with stakeholders over the summer once we get through this final sort of queue of pending applications for this round.
Thank you. Let's see. Another question for you, Tim. Given the challenges that a lot of the first round projects are going to be facing to convert to permanent supportive housing and accessing capital to do that, is there any possibility that Homekey would provide, say, another capital contribution to those projects to help facilitate their conversion to permanent?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we are very cognizant that there's a relatively large batch of Homekey projects sort of in the interim to perm bucket from Homekey round one, where they've converted to interim, but there's a second conversion that needs to take place. And how is that going to be funded? We have seen some projects from Homekey 1.0 sort of coming in for other HCD funding, right? So, the multifamily housing program, the No Place Like Home program. We have a few others that can provide support in that area. So we've seen some of that already. I know some other Homekey One projects have come in for tax credits. All those programs, though, are of course generally oversubscribed, so it's difficult to say for sure whether it'll work for all the other projects that are in the queue. So certainly we can take that back and give that some consideration. I would also add, and I alluded to this in my first answer, what we are seeing in Homekey 2.0 is it's a relatively small universe of projects that kind of fall into that interim to perm bucket. Most are going to be perm straight away, and then a batch of others will be interim in perpetuity. So to the extent we have a large number from Homekey 1.0, I don't think there's going to be sort of a snowball effect in Homekey from the Homekey 2.0 cohort or the Homekey 3.0 cohort. So I think it's sort of an issue that is somewhat contained to the 1.0 group, but it's a very important issue nonetheless, and it's definitely on our radar to provide technical assistance where we can and provide support where we can in terms of getting those projects to a proper conversion in the coming years.
Okay. Thank you. And then I have one last question for you. We're anticipating that retail and office real estate sectors are going to be severely have been severely impacted by COVID and may be available at a better price point than other classes of real estate. And so we're wondering if HCD is receptive to the idea of providing more time to adaptive reuse proposals to meet the performance milestones.
That's a great question. We are, of course, super interested in, sort of maintaining the cost effectiveness of this program. And to the extent sort of the hospitality space is rebounding and those prices are elevating, if more retail and commercial spaces are the new sort of distressed asset, I think we'd want to see those types of sites utilized. And we have seen actually some of those projects come through. I wouldn't say it's common, but we have seen a relative handful, even this round. The timing did work out, in some cases, although I know the timing is challenging. The one, potential barrier I would point out is that those performance milestones, in particular the 8 months that we sort of mandate to have the funds spent, that is in statute. So that's sort of the one sort of barrier that may be in place here. Maybe there's an opportunity to do some kind of, pilot or something. So we're happy to look into that as we kind of think through Homekey 3. I will give the caveat that Homekey is sort of the program that delivers results quickly, right? And I think we want to still maintain that sense of urgency writ large and not slow down the train too much for this program, given sort of the vast numbers out there that need housing. So happy to take that back, and I think it's a valid point, because that type of project can take a little bit longer to put together relative to like motel acquisitions and things of that nature.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, City and County of LA. I'd like to know, well, I think for the benefit of our audience, it would be great if you guys could talk a little bit about how your approach to Homekey, or how you wanted to use Homekey, changed from round 1 to round 2, and why. And maybe Anne, you could start off.
Sure, thanks, Yasmin, and hello, everybody. So in round one, there were a lot of differences. It was being administered out of our city administrative office that deals with homelessness. So, like the difference in the county between the CEO's office and going over to the Community Development Commission would be similar. So round one, it was really focused on how do we meet our goals for serving as many people experiencing homelessness as possible. The other big difference in round one, of course, was that the cities, at least we did, still had coronavirus relief funds available to put into, matching this. So just as the state was putting in money that didn't have a whole lot of, of regulations imposed by outside parties, so at least was the city of LA, basically whatever rules we all wanted to make up. And so round two, not only are we out of coronavirus relief money, because it all got spent filling gaps, which the state had, I think, more ungap filling money than most of the cities did. So we're out of coronavirus relief money, so we're using other housing dollars that have restrictions. So, HHH dollars, which can't be used for operating, for instance, or CDBG or home or things like that. So we're trying to match those. So we made the shift from interim to perm in the first round to all perm in the second round in response to, I think, partly the third thing really was that the voucher shortage that you're talking about and the operating costs, to operate an interim housing project is roughly $2,500 a month, and to operate a permanent unit is far less. And if you can get a voucher, then, it's even more reliable than that. So those all sort of, plus, as we all say, you're still homeless when you're in an interim, project or in a shelter. So we wanted people to be moving into permanent housing as part of our overall plan.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for that question. There was a pretty significant shift in our approach between Homekey 1 and 2, and some of the reasons were similar to what Anne mentioned. We did 9 of our 10 properties for Homekey 1 were interim to permanent conversions, and part of that was the requirement that we occupy the sites within 30 to 90 days of closing escrow. So, because we were purchasing hotels that most of them were not suitable for permanent housing immediately, we really had no choice but to occupy them as interim housing if we were going to meet that deadline. So that was, part of what was driving that. We also were using the Homekey sites to help with the demobilization of some of our Roomkey sites, which I think a lot of folks on the webinar will be familiar with that program, where we were leasing hotels during the kind of peak of the pandemic. So having those sites function as interim housing helped us as we were closing some of those PRK sites to have a destination to put people. In Homekey 2, we pursued a mix of permanent and interim housing. None of them are interim to permanent conversions. And we also applied jointly with co-applicants for all of the projects that we submitted to HCD. So that was a big shift, and we did a solicitation to identify the co-applicants and partnered with a really wonderful group of co-applicants, some of whom are fellow panelists, and that helped us to tap into the expertise of our affordable housing developer community and homeless service provider community. The co-applicants are also going to ultimately be the owners of these properties rather than the county owning them, which is the case for the Homekey 1 properties, although we are making a transition with those Homekey 1 properties that I can talk about a little more later. So we learned a lot from Homekey 1 and applied some of those learnings to Homekey 2, and I'm sure we'll continue to learn as we move forward with Homekey 2.
Right, thanks. And again, for both of you, can you talk a bit about how you're preparing to support the conversion to permanent supportive housing? And I mean, we're talking about roughly 1,600 units of motel rooms that have converted to interim housing, and now they're going to need kitchens and other things to be, used as permanent supportive housing.
I can start on that. The LA County Board of Supervisors allocated a significant chunk of our American Rescue Plan funding to the conversions. So some funding was allocated to Homekey 2 and some to the Homekey 1 conversions. So we are really grateful for the board's leadership in prioritizing addressing homelessness with these funds. We're sort of in the midst of a bit of a shift in how we're approaching the Homekey 1 conversions. We did recently release a solicitation to identify developers who would be interested in converting the sites and then owning the properties. Initially, we were looking at doing that kind of in-house with our public works department, and that's still an option that's on the table, but we are looking for partners now to help with that conversion. And we do hope to get started with the construction as soon as possible so that we can quickly expand our permanent housing availability.
Thanks, Yasmin. So the city has a few sites going through the conversion process right now, leveraging some philanthropic money that became available. So we're very grateful for that. I think the city is more out of vouchers than the county is. The county's right behind us, but we're even tighter than there. And it's really hard to do much of the conversion, especially if you're trying to aim to bring other sources in, whether it's other HCD programs or tax credits or anything. Those folks are going to require more than a hope and a prayer that you're going to meet the operating expenses over time. And without, a long-term commitment like a voucher, you don't really have that to bring to the table. So I think for us, we did put a lot of our home ARP money, as Elizabeth was saying, we put a lot into Homekey 2 and some into our pipeline, our managed pipeline that could serve these projects. But without the vouchers to activate it, we are really trying to find other solutions. And I think Tim touched on it in the idea, which probably would apply more to our portfolio of Homekey 2 properties, of mixing incomes, going into the future. Like there's no way, if the average cost to operate a supportive housing project is $800 or $900 per unit per month, there's no way without a voucher that you can get there if all of your units or even half of your units are for supportive housing. So you'd have to do a little more of a old-fashioned tax credit mix than we're doing right now. All the units being affordable, but not all the units being deeply, deeply affordable. So of course, we basically have everybody on the prayer plan, praying that some version of the Build Back Better thing passes, praying that our House LA, not ours, citizen initiative, which is going to be on the ballot, we hope in November, will pass, which will have money for both subsidies and capital. So I should just, full disclaimer, signatures are still being counted, so I shouldn't be too sanguine, but there were a lot of signatures turned in, so we're hoping that will be on the ballot. But really, it's all going to come down to the vouchers.
And one more follow-up question along these same lines is, given the anticipated expense of converting some of these properties, is there any utility in maintaining them as interim housing, i.e. not doing the permanent supportive housing conversion? Oh, I see Stephanie shaking her head now. Stephanie, why don't you chime in?
Sorry, Anne, do you want to answer? I was just shaking my head.
$2,500 a month. It's magic money. Where are we going to come up with the operating costs? So I would just, Steph, you're the one who knows.
It's not only the operating costs, but in principle, these buildings are not designed to be permanent housing. No one should live in interim housing permanently. That doesn't define it as permanent housing, and yet we have thousands of people living in interim housing with no place to go because we are not making the investment into permanent housing if we need to. So it's not just a daily operational reason and the cost of that, of why we shouldn't keep these buildings as interim housing, but it's the humane reason. People are still homeless when they are living in interim housing. If we are really making an effort to leverage this one-time opportunity, we missed an opportunity in converting these buildings by the way to permanent supportive housing, because you can't develop a permanent housing strategy for the city of Los Angeles on a hope and a prayer, as Anne was saying, we need to do on the 1.0 portfolio.
Anne, Liz, any follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, I think, we recently, last week, the board approved a reassessment of our strategies to address homelessness, as well as recommendations from our Blue Ribbon Commission. And I think, throughout those different reports and recommendations, there's just a resounding agreement that we need more permanent housing, and our homeless services system is not functioning properly because we don't have flow through the system. We can't move people out of interim housing because there's no permanent housing to put them in, and we can't move people off the streets into interim housing because people aren't moving out of interim housing. So, we feel really strongly that increasing the supply of permanent housing is the central, key to addressing homelessness here in LA County.
Anne, do you have anything else to add? Or
I mean, that makes total sense. I just, the sources, so, get down to nuts and bolts, the sources of money to operate interim housing are much more limited for the city. The county has Measure H, which of course they generously share with the city, but that's coming to the end of its life in a few years. So, we need to think down the, into the future about how are we going to operate these. And even though what I've heard from our provider friends that these, as interim, these tend to have people stay in them a lot longer than other interim choices. For me, I always say it's all about the bathroom, baby. If you've got your own door and your own bathroom, people are more comfortable staying for a while until they can find a permanent placement, but that means that you don't have any flow through. So they really are sort of less than great permanent solutions. And I think that's what we're trying to address.
thanks. Well, now I wanted to just kind of open it up. I mean, since we've got Tim in the Zoom room, I'd like to just ask all of our panelists to, what suggestions do you have for Project Homekey, or for the city or county of Los Angeles about how to implement this program? Now's your chance. Go, Stephanie.
I think, and with all due respect, I think you short-shifted the list of how significantly LHD fortunately changed Project Homekey 1.0 into how you changed 2.0 from what the standards were in 1.0. And there were three really key things that LAHD did differently when they were leading it under 2.0. The first was a focus on quality. Under 1.0, there was a race to the application, and the focus not being led by the real estate team of the city of Los Angeles, focused on quantity, and as such, purchased severely depressed properties that needed such substantial rehab just to operate as interim. And just so everyone knows, the first 15 properties purchased for the city of Los Angeles, many of them have not even completed their rehab to be operating fully as interim housing because it's taken this long. It's been over a year. We just got permits from the fire department to do one of ours, 2 months ago. It took a year. So number one, you focused on quality of assets that were purchased instead of quantity. That was huge. The second was removing, can you hear me better now? Yes. Sure.
No, I wonder, can you shift?
I don't even know where my mic is, so I'm just talking loudly.
Or do you have headphones, Stephanie?
Use your outside voice.
Oh, here's my outside voice. I don't, if anyone who's on this, Ella, can bring me headphones. So number one was we focused on quantity over quality, quality over quantity. That was huge. The second was removing this requirement to operate as interim housing, and you're going straight to PSH. That was huge. The fact that you're setting aside capital funds and project-based vouchers under 2.0 is a game changer. And it's really unheard of what is going to happen to the 1.0 PHK buildings when the county funds go away for operations. And then the last thing that I mentioned at the beginning is being led by the housing department instead of the CAO's department. The CAO's department did a great job with what they could do, but they're not real estate developers. And so it was kind of always an uphill thing. So I think there's more strategy. But the last thing, so thank you for all those changes and recognizing what the deficiencies were in 1.0 for us. The second really key thing though, that I hope we don't all ignore is there is value, financial value in tenant-based vouchers. There is a surplus of tenant-based vouchers and a surplus of individuals who qualify for them. And LA Family Housing has really been leading conversations with conventional lenders on underwriting debt against tenant-based vouchers and not being so beholden to the project-based vouchers for which there is a shortage. So that we are proposing to leverage, to convert 3 of our buildings. And none of them are we doing with public dollars because it increases the cost and increases the time. And we're doing it just by leveraging philanthropic support with private debt leveraged against tenant-based vouchers. So there really is a model that can be done, although it does require philanthropic partnership to see it through. But we are able to save on all 3 of our buildings, $4 million per building and 2.5 years per building on bringing these units online at a lower cost and faster. All because of the one-time opportunity of Project Homekey. So thank you, state. And now we just need to make a few more advances in the city.
I would thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel, and it's great to be here with our state, county, and city representatives. And I have Homekey projects with both the city and the state. And one is converting to interim housing, and the other one is actually about to convert into PSH early because of the support of the Hilton Foundation. So, and we are new to this space. And so Homekey's opportunity, obviously, to use existing assets, distressed assets, as you call them, Tim, is beneficial. And obviously use state dollars to acquire those has been really helpful, but also for those of us who have been doing work in this sector for so long, allowing us an opportunity to kind of move the needle and provide long-term permanent housing has been really important. I think that what I just want to lift up to start is, the piece, I appreciate the recommendations from the 2 presentations that we started with, but the piece about the intergovernmental clusters or working groups or whatever you want to call them is critically important. So as Stephanie spoke about on the city side, it was very difficult, but, I think that even with it moving to LAHD, still having to coordinate with all these different departments and they're not being with all of the projects coming online, Homekey and otherwise, quite frankly, to have to go from pillar to post with mixed messaging, right? And different interpretations of different things from different departments. I mean, it's just that's not a burden as we're, beginning to use this innovative resource that I think that the developers and providers should have to hold. And so I really hope that, and Tim, I think this is a little bit out of your purview, so I guess I'm speaking to our city and county, folks. I think it's critically important that we bring all these folks together, given the number of the developments taking place, so that they work out the details and the kinks, right? And we have clusters of people from DWP, Public Works, Building and Safety, Littering. And, I've pitched this before where you have maybe 3 or 4 of those teams that include all of these different parties, and they're assigned to the different projects so that we don't have to do all that heavy lifting. The CAST people, just all these things, the disability things gets really, really challenging because of different interpretations. Like, I think that we are in a space where the state has created something that has allowed us to significantly increase the utilization of the assets, acquire them, and reduce costs and move them forward faster. And now we need the infrastructure and the system by which we do that to shift to support that work in a way that's meaningful. The only other thing I would say, and I'm glad you raised, Tim, that the 8-month piece is the statute, because that is very difficult, right? Even when you're looking at owners who are motivated, right? And folks that we may know. And so I don't know, what the wiggle room is around that, but for Homekey 3.0, obviously people are starting to prepare now, right? And they're spending their own dollars to try to do some of the due diligence to be able to submit something that actually meets the need, and can, hit the ground running and meet those 8-month and 12-month timing requirements. And I don't know if there's any wiggle room as it relates to the statute, but I think that, some really creative, cost-effective projects might be presented even more so if there's some wiggle room around that piece of it. But just overall, I'm grateful for the opportunity for Homekey. I think that, again, as someone spoke to earlier, it shows that when there's a political will and dollars behind it, we can do anything, even seemingly the most unimaginable thing. And I think that I'm really excited that it's not over yet. And I'm grateful to be a part of it. And I think that hopefully we can learn. And our philanthropic partners, I just want to lift up, are critically important, because with the City of LA projects, we have, I think there's 4 of us, I think we're all here, that are going to start early. And so I think that that's critically important. And, to Stephanie's point about the tenant-based piece, I think that obviously the project-based vouchers are at a limit, and so are tenant-based, but not as much so. And so hopefully we can work with the city who, we're still grappling with trying to figure out how we're going to pay for the operational costs, to figure out how to secure some tenant-based vouchers in the absence of the project-based vouchers for the Homekey 1.0 stuff that's converting early.
Great, thanks, Veronica. Anyone else on the operator side? Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that thank you again. Yeah, thanks for having us. It's great to have this conversation and having Tim on. I kind of do want to say that the state could hold the cities and counties accountable for some of the streamlining that my colleagues have talked about, because you are investing so much in building out, what's critically needed, which is the permanent housing. So we have 3 Homekey 1.0 projects. One went directly to permanent, which was amazing. And it's been operational now, it seems like for I'm thinking 18 months close to. And then I have one that's been an interim for almost a year and one that's still not even open. So you can really see kind of the difference depending on that deferred maintenance that might have been there. But I think the other thing we need to look at is, what streamlining can we do for these projects, knowing that they have such a tight timeline, because we don't want to lose political will as well, or community will. So I love the co-applicant process with the county, because what that allowed us to do too is we can be a little more in charge of the community engagement. When the city or county applies directly and then selects a provider, we're going in after the fact, and we get a lot of questions around, why didn't you tell us? And wait a minute, you're going to be there long term, and yet you say you're opening within a couple of months. And what I've noticed with the co-applicant approach is that we can actually start doing some of that community engagement, because likely we might find other funding sources for that site, if Homekey is not an option. So I just think looking at development partners is really important, and then really calling in our state and county partners to find out how they are going to make this process a little bit faster to keep with Homekey's goals, and what can they do within their own infrastructure to really push that forward.
Great point, Jennifer. Thank you. John, I really want to get you in here. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for including me. And I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I think one thing I want to lift up, and I know that we're very kind of future oriented in thinking about the next iterations of Homekey, but I think in the 1.0 round, we should not lose sight of the fact that it is going to take a significant amount of capital investment to make those conversions. So I do hope that will not get lost in the shuffle. I think the lessons learned, I think Stephanie, you, I think very correctly amplified all the changes that were made that were really positive, but sometimes, the pioneers are the people with the arrows in their backs. And I think that in the first round, a lot of organizations, including mine, took on, significant responsibilities. And I think the changes that have been made in the subsequent rounds, where there is a commitment on the conversion dollars, is really important. Of course, vouchers ultimately are going to be important to all of these projects, going forward. But I do hope that there will be some consideration of thinking about whether it's Homekey funds or other ways to weave in state, or I know that the American, Rescue Plan funds and the federal dollars, I think are not going to be flowing in the ways in the future that they certainly have in the past. So just to think about how that might be accommodated. Yeah.
Great, thank you, John. We have 10 minutes left, and I would, for this panel discussion, then we're going to get to the Q&A. But I think for the last question, wanted to ask you all to talk about the pros and cons, I guess, or what your impressions have been now that you've been operating interim housing in a private room format as opposed to the congregate facilities that have typically been the mode of providing interim housing. And that's again open to everybody on the panel.
How is my sound now?
Much better.
Oh, thank you, Elsa. Thank you. So LA Family Housing operates multiple models of interim housing, from the single motel rooms that we did with Project Roomkey and now under the Homekey, to I think part of the presentation before, some dollars were used maybe up in Oakland buying single family homes, using them as kind of a shared setting for multiple families to share, to semi-congregate, semi meaning it might be a building where 3 to 4 unrelated people share a room, to full room congregate with semi-private living situations. So we have an example of 4 or 5 different models of interim housing. And it is true that moving out of a single motel room is harder, because it is the sort of nicest model for an individual to have that kind of privacy and to close their door, and harder for folks to move out. But quite frankly, the throughput is just so enormously challenged in Los Angeles. We don't have places for people to go under any of the models. And that's why it's so critical that these buildings don't remain as interim housing, but convert to permanent supportive housing. If you follow the rule of thumb that we should have 5 permanent housing units for every 1 bed of interim, we are sorely, short of that, of course, in Los Angeles.
If I can add, and so at Hopix, we do all the different models that Stephanie talked about LA Family Housing doing, and just add safe parking to that, right? And even a model where we have families in trailers that came from Governor Newsom. So we do all those models. And so obviously, as you reported, if people can have their own space, in most cases, that's ideal, right? And so naturally, folks that may have declined, that our street engagement teams had been building a rapport with and had known for years, who had said no to the other types of interim housing, say yes this time, right? And so that was impactful because we were able to get folks who may have been the most vulnerable off of the street. Some of the challenges, though, when you talk about folks going into isolation, I just have to say, and I think that we're learning and we're growing and we're building. So we've had people in motels forever, but this type of model, I think, it's appropriate for people to have their own space. Let me just say that. All of us need our own space. We need a place to retreat at the end of the day. And so obviously it's a very meaningful opportunity to be able to offer that to folks. And at the same time, we've been very cognizant of ensuring that the supportive services piece doesn't get lost, because folks are locked up in a room, and that the pieces of the things that come along with isolation when you've been living in a community, even if it was living in a community outdoors, doesn't impact people in a negative way. And so yes, it's a beautiful opportunity. I think it's important. We need the throughput to move them forward so they don't sit there for a whole year. But we also just need to make sure that operators of these types of models understand and have social service, mental health, trauma-informed lenses, like truly, not just, it's the buzz term, but really in practice, operate those things so that folks don't decline, because we've seen that as well. If you don't operate your programs in an appropriate way, it sometimes can have a negative consequence with folks in their rooms all the time.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Did somebody want to go? I would say that I agree with that. It's much easier to incentivize people to come in doors when they have a private space. It's much harder to encourage them to leave unless they're going to another private space. So I agree with you, Stephanie, that I think that as we think about the flow through in the system, that the exit from the individual hotel sites has to be equivalent to or better than what they have now, or else it's not much of an incentive for people to move through. And we operate congregate, facilities as well, and certainly have seen the preferences shift, especially with the outreach teams as they're offering housing opportunities, that overwhelmingly people will select a private room over any congregate facility.
Yeah.
One thing I want to add is, as a system, we didn't come up with, during these past 2 years, we did not come up with a prioritization system through LAHSA on who would be moving into congregate versus who would be moving into a project Homekey. And so what it did for providers and outreach teams is have a lot of participants say, no, I'm going to hold out till that hotel opens up. And we could have way more vacancies now in our congregate settings because people want to go into the hotel motel model of interim housing. So I would say that if a region is going to have that wide a variety of interim housing options, it needs to develop some form of prioritization of who goes into which kind of model, because it is challenging. But my recommendation is this type of model really should be focused on a permanent solution, not necessarily an interim. And then in our other models, provide more of the privacy spaces and quality trauma-informed care that our participants all deserve.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. Jennifer, is there anything that you'd like to add to this?
The only thing I was just going to share is, as we're trying, I think specifically in LA, but I see it throughout the state, to really reframe shared housing as a permanent option for many peoples, maybe older adults, youth. It's been really hard, we've seen with our congregate programs, to get them to go into shared housing once they've had their own room. So to Stephanie's point about prioritization, it's definitely something I know we're looking at when we look at our own internal continuum of care, is how are we starting those conversations, and how are we getting them to kind of agree to that when that's likely going to be their option if they're not going to qualify for a voucher.
And I just want to know, you're trying to, as Ann said, in many cases, it's all about the restroom, right? But I think, to Jennifer's point, we have successfully, we've had to get creative in this space. And so we have, and when we say shared housing, we're talking about lock and key into one room, but you may have to share a restroom, right? And so I think that we're looking at those things. The other thing I just want to lift up really quick. So again, I have 2 Homekey projects. One is converting to PSAs. One is interim housing. So I do wholeheartedly agree that Homekey should be prioritized for permanent supportive housing. At the same time, though, as obviously one of the interim housing providers where the site is not going to convert, it's provided an opportunity in a community, in a city, where to use one of those other models in terms of master lease and single homes or other things is just not possible. And so the ability to have Homekey brought into this city, in particular, I'm talking about the city of Compton, we would not have been able to create a stable place for families with children who are experiencing homelessness in Compton to go. This was the only way, one of the few ways, and there's 2 Homekey sites in Compton, right? One of them we own, and the other one the county is trying to figure out who the developer is going to be. But before that, we did not have any spaces for families, and this allowed us the opportunity to do that. So I just have to say, I agree with my colleague about it should be prioritizing PSH, but at the same time, it's allowed us to do some things for the ones that are not going to convert, that are going to stay in interim housing, that we were unable to do in a community that did not have any resources for interim housing. So I just have to say that.
Thank you. We have one more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly jump in on the prioritization question, because I do think that, for most of our Homekey sites, we are still prioritizing people who are high risk COVID, vulnerable older folks. So, that is shifting a little bit as the pandemic, enters a different phase, but that has been one of the mechanisms to prioritize. And then the other thing I wanted to add, Veronica mentioned the city of Compton, and earlier there was some talk about, the challenges of getting cities to streamline their processes. One of our unique challenges here in LA County is that we do have 88 cities. The county, has Homekey sites in a number of different cities, as well as in the unincorporated area in the city of Los Angeles. So, we're really facing a varied landscape, and many cities are interested to come to the table and collaborate with us. But it does create some unique challenges for those operating in the county of Los Angeles.
Great, thank you, Liz. Okay, so I think we have a little bit of Q&A here. I want to encourage we have a big audience. I'm surprised that we're not seeing more questions showing up in the Q&A. So you guys get busy. All right, and I believe that Ayat, you are going to be taking us through the Q&A. All right.
Yeah. So I will just read out the question, and then we can direct it accordingly. So we got a question from Andrew. You mentioned that developers found that converting motel units were way more expensive than expected. Can you give an example of what caused the additional costs?
Ayat, there was a big echo, so I think I'm gonna take the reins here, because I don't think I'm having the same issues with the audio. So let's see. I'm just going from top to bottom. Is there any consideration of different regional operating costs and the Homekey operating expense subsidy for future Homekey rounds, i.e., monthly operating costs in LA are higher than in Redding?
It's probably for me. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, right? And it also applies on the capital side, just sort of the different, obviously, real estate markets, urban versus rural, coastal versus inland. So it's pretty complicated to do that. This kind of dice up the state, but certainly it's something that we'll consider for Homekey 3, and just to sort of ensure that these funds are deployed as efficiently as possible. So I think it's a very fair question.
Let's see. This next question is from Trisha Levine. Okay, what's the future of NPLH funding after initial funding has been expended? Is there talk about a new Prop 63 bond for housing? Tim, I don't know if that's in your on your radar or not, but
yeah, I mean, we are in the final round of No Place Like Home funding right now. Like, the final batch of awards are coming out in June. So as we speak today, there's nothing on the table to extend it, but obviously we are at the tail end of this fiscal year, and we have a budget process to go through to get a final budget for 22-23. So we'll just have to let that process play out and see what comes of it. But nothing real definitive to share at this point. Obviously, it is on our radar, though, very, very much. And it's a program that we've worked, very hard to implement over the last few years, and we're very proud of. And there's a number of, NPLH projects that are sort of under construction right now. So we look forward to those coming online, in the years to come.
okay, let's see. Then the next question is there a sense of the average case management ratio and time spent with clients at these Homekey projects? I know who would like to take that one. Maybe Jennifer.
I mean, we might have slightly different ratios, but I know for the conversion, we all probably, if we're funded through the county's Department of Health program, we're looking at a 1-to-20 ratio. In terms of time spent, I mean, I think the thing that, I love about really all of our affordable and supportive housing developments is that we create a community. So it's time spent one-on-one with folks, but it's also those after hours activities, those holiday gatherings, bringing in experts for health, for well-being, for wellness. So when we look at it, we're engaging individuals on a regular basis. I would say we're looking at probably anywhere from 5 to 10 hours a person a month, at least. It could be more, could be slightly less if you're just building rapport. But that's just the hours are off the top of my head. And then interim, We look at a lower caseload ratio, and that's because we're trying to get them into permanent housing. So we actually staff interim with everybody kind of has a caseload. We changed to that model a few years ago. So we're looking at about a 1 to 10 caseload ratio. Doesn't mean they don't have other things, but we try to hire folks who really, we call it a whatever it takes approach. But so they have that case management skill, and then they might also be able to support in other areas, so we can get folks into permanent housing as available. So those are our models.
I wanted to add one big piece with interim housing and points of engagement. As an interim housing provider, we are all still required to provide 3 meals a day to all the residents. That's an enormous cost under these motels because there are no kitchens in the assets that were purchased, at least the assets that we acquired. There are no kitchens. There was no commercial kitchen at the property, so we had to take a unit offline to have, commercial refrigerators there to store pre-made food that we distribute. One, that's a cost, but it's also a point of engagement. So there's a real positive to that, because if you are ensuring that you're seeing people every day, and it might not be for a case management kind of meeting, but it is a point of engagement, and that's really what is needed to build trust and to understand what people's unique needs are. You might be delivering food to somebody's room and see that they've got hoarding conditions going on in the room, but you wouldn't know it unless you came into the room because you were delivering food every day. So I think the staffing ratio versus the points of engagement are different ways to think about how we work with our participants living in these properties.
Veronica, John, do you want to add anything or?
No, I think everything Jennifer and Stephanie said resonates. We can.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we staff 1 to 20 is our ratio as well. And I agree with the engagement. It's not just the staffing ratio, which is important, but it's also the points of contact that staff have, throughout the day and the week with individual residents.
Great. Okay, this question is from Elizabeth Anderson. We have an application in for Homekey and we're waiting with fingers crossed. More prayers. We are hoping to share success stories about motels converted into interim housing and how that improved and or did not impact the local business community. Is there a place to find contact info for success stories? We have business community members on the verge of NIMBY. I don't know if Carolina, I don't know if like contact information is available for any of the sort of short case studies that you've done. And I'm not sure if we're providing, but I know that with the case studies that we're providing for this enterprise research, that it'll be clear who the operator is, and you can access them.
Yeah, but they share, Yasmin, because I think we're one of your cases. Sites in South LA. We
Definitely.
have right, and we're and actually both of our home chemotherapy, there has been a significant amount of illicit activity. We were one of the ones that was referenced in terms of the sheriff's department having to be there all the time. That's the one in and so there was a significant amount of illicit activity, a lot of criminal activity. And so the community and the residents and the business owners have embraced us. They're excited they can actually see a difference on the corner that we're on. And so we've gotten a significant amount of support, even in terms of in-kind donations, people around us wanting to know how they can help. And obviously that won't be the case in every community, but many of these motels, unfortunately, do have similar stories. And so I think we've been able to demonstrate the value add, not only to obviously get the neighbors who are unhoused off of the street and have them safely housed there, but also to shift the environment at these locations that we now have site control over. So definitely would be willing to share and have my team share more for the person who asked that question, if they would like that.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? This is your chance, audience. You've got the Homekey experts. Homekey experts here.
Q&A that I didn't hear you ask. There's a few other questions here that I didn't hear you pose in the Q&A. I don't know if you want to read them, but there's a few more here.
I think I've gone through all of them. Oh, I'm sorry, I did miss this one from Teddy Pierce. As SRO housing, what would make these permanent supportive housing? And then historically, wasn't SRO housing considered workforce housing? I'll hazard a response to this one about SRO housing and what would make it permanent supportive. I think a lot of times with SRO housing, it does not have a restroom or kitchen facilities. And in order for these units to convert, then they will need to have a kitchen or some kind of cooking facilities. And I believe all of these, motel, hotel properties do have like a private bathroom. So at least that does not have to be retrofitted into the unit. All right, let's see. And then from Chin Woo Choi, hi Chin. How are the city and county proposing to use home ARP for Homekey funding?
The county is using ARP funds for both capital and shorter term operating costs, because obviously there's an expenditure deadline. So we're using it kind of across the board for different purposes which are eligible. And if I could just jump back to a last question really quick, I just wanted to say that I think what makes it supportive is like the features that you mentioned, but also the intensive case management services that are provided on site. That's really what is central to making it permanent supportive housing.
Thank you.
Which also requires having service space to deliver that. So, there was a big challenge with the original Homekey 1.0 also about not allowing us to take units offline. And that was a challenge relative to, well, where do we deliver services? Because these motels don't have community rooms, things like that. So we had to take a few units offline for staff offices, but also, as I mentioned earlier, for the commercial refrigerators to store all the food that we are delivering all day. So being sure that there is a space to deliver those services too.
Okay. And I think John's staff was providing services in a tent in the parking lot. I may be exaggerating, but so yeah, it's been a real challenge to find ways to accommodate providing those services on site. Okay, well, thanks for those great questions. We're going to now transition into our final reflections before we sign off. So Project Homekey has been moving so fast and furious that there's still a lot that we don't know and still a lot that we're learning about how to best use the funding to address all these unmet needs. So some of the things that we've identified that, where there's definitely room for more information and analysis. One is to, once we understand what the costs are for converting more of these permanent supportive housing units, that'll be really helpful to understand really the efficacy of this strategy of interim to permanent and its cost efficiency. And then also, I mentioned earlier that just having a better understanding, better information about participant outcomes and how the Homekey sites compare to congregate. So that's another, very rich area for further inquiry. And then, I think another big question is, as the economy is starting to bounce back and actually really heat up, how are we going to use these limited Homekey dollars to kind of have the biggest impact and optimize the potential investment? And then, I think for our housing operators who are coming out of pocket to provide the interim housing, how can we raise more resources for them to not have to come out of pocket to advance their mission and serve these unmet needs. So I think that's everything that we're. So we're going to have a release, like this webinar recording and the presentation materials, the PowerPoint will be available, I guess, on Enterprise's website. And yes, as I mentioned, that our written report and findings, as well as the case studies, will be available in the summertime. And you can contact Mark or Ayat at Enterprise for additional questions. And I really want to thank all of our participants on the panel today, not just for participating on the panel, but also for your dedication and hard work in making Homekey happen in Los Angeles. It's really a heroic effort that you've all put in, from HCD down to Compton, to make all this happen in such a short period of time. So I really want to acknowledge everyone for that work, and also I want to thank the Hilton Foundation for supporting this research and this dialogue. So with that, I think we'll say thank you to everyone and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.